Everybody I have talked to for several days now has been very disturbed by the killings that took place in Jonesboro this last week. And I know that it's emphasized more and more by the fact that you had a boy 11 years old and a boy 13 years old with hunting rifles back there, at least one of whom was a crack shot apparently, and who were mowing people down like dolls in a shooting gallery. And it's so appalling, and the hurt, the pain, the suffering, and the loss that this has caused. Not only the loss of those 5 girls, and of course then 4 girls, I believe, and then the teacher who was killed, but the 2 boys' lives are essentially lost. Their lives are over. But you know, the situation down there is not unique. A great deal has been made about it. Everybody's been really fascinated by it. But there are hundreds of killings every year in this country by children. Children killing children is a phenomenon that people are wandering around in circles, shaking their head over and trying their best to try to understand what in the world is going on. That this is happening in our society, in our nation, and it's not peculiar to our nation. It's going on overseas as well. Sometimes many of the same kinds of killing. Well, everybody's trying to understand it, and everybody's trying to put their spin on the story. And the people who are of one political point of view will say, well, it's because of this. Another will say, no, it's because of that. And I know that there's going to be a great deal of intense investigation of the background of each of these 2 boys. Try to understand why they did what they did and how such a thing could happen. I would say the chances are that most of that research or work that's going to be done in the background of those 2 boys is a waste of time. It will come ultimately to understanding the problem, and any decisions you might make to deal with the problem. Chasing down the background of these 2 boys, I think, will lead straight to a dead end. Because there is no simple answer to this problem of violence among youth, the children killing children. But there is an answer. And the answer does not really lie so much in the children as it lies in us. As Pogo said, we have met the enemy, and he is us. The answer to these problems of youth killing youth, of violence in general, of a young woman and a young man, and go into a motel and give birth to a baby and then go outside and throw the baby away in a trash can. The answers to this kind of problem that's going on in our society are far too complex to be traced down by looking at what happened in this boy's life and looking at what happened in this girl's life and what kind of a home life did this child have. I am not suggesting for a moment that those things do not have a bearing. Every single one of them has a bearing on what takes place, but there are people in this room who are living wholesome, healthy lives who come from broken homes. There are people in this room who grew up around guns all the time in their life, had guns in the house and played with guns, looked at guns, cleaned guns, shot guns and everything else, and never killed anybody with them and would never think of killing anybody with them. I mean, I've known guns ever since I was old enough to know anything. And not only would I never think of killing people, I finally got tired of killing deer and quit that. Because it just didn't seem like something I wanted to do. And so on it goes, you know, but you can, from whatever cause you can find in these children's background that they did this, you will find all kinds of children who had the same thing in their background who did not do that. And that is where your problem comes when you start trying to deal with these things in a sociological manner. Now, as I said, there is an answer. It is not a simple answer, but there is an answer. And my message today is going to be centered on the book of Hosea, an Old Testament prophet in the nation of Israel. Israel as opposed to Judah. I think many of you know that in history there was a time when Israel was one kingdom. Under David and under Saul, then David and under Solomon, they were one kingdom. And after the death of Solomon, the kingdom was divided into 2, the kingdom of Judah in the south and the kingdom of Israel in the north, with 10 tribes that went north and created a separate kingdom, and Benjamin, Judah, and Levi that stayed in the south and created the other kingdom. These kingdoms, as they proceeded through time, proceeded in their own way into different kinds of corruption. And God sent prophets in both directions to both of these kingdoms from time to time to address the difficulties, the problems, and the decay that had taken place in these kingdoms. Hosea was a prophet sent to the northern kingdom. with a very specific message. He's fairly late in their history at a time of intense corruption among these people. And God sends him along with a very special message. And I want to call your attention today, in particular, to chapter 4. Hosea chapter 4. Hear the word of the Lord, you children of Israel, for the Lord has a controversy with the inhabitants of the land, because there is no truth, nor mercy, nor knowledge of God in the land. Now, it's often been said that those who cannot learn the lessons of history are condemned to repeat them. And here is a lesson from history. Many of you know that there are those of us who firmly believe that these prophecies, in so much as they are directed at the end time, are directed at our own people, the United States, Great Britain, Australia, Canada, Northern Europe, because we believe that ethnically speaking, as well as typologically speaking in the Bible, that we actually are the people of Israel at the end time. It's very clear in the prophets, as you come down to the very end time, that the house of Israel and the house of Judah exist as two separate, distinct political entities at the end time. Now, you have no particular trouble figuring out who the house of Judah is. Their capital is in Jerusalem. It's what we call Israel today. The problem you face if you're a student of prophecy is, where then, since the house of Israel is a separate political entity, where is the house of Israel? Well, we believe that it's the United States and Great Britain. But now, lay that aside for the moment. There is also a kind of typological, that is the imagery of prophecy, a typological identity of peoples in the end time, and that is, does the prophecy fit? There's also the question of, well, you've all heard that history repeats itself. What you may not realize is that history repeats itself because we may keep making the same stupid mistakes. We do the same thing, the same results take place. They say that a definition of insanity is when you keep doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. But that's mankind. We are more than a little bit crazy. We keep doing the same thing. We keep making the same mistakes. The problem is, apart from the normal course of human events, that God doesn't change either. And if he responded in a certain way to an activity of man in time past, why should we expect him to respond any differently to the same thing in the 20th century? And we as a people, as a nation, do seem to have been among the most blessed by God in history. We believe that God was behind the establishment of the United States of America. We believe that Great Britain and the United States were blessed by God above all peoples on the face of this planet. We believe that we have had his very great blessings throughout times in our history. We believe that we have had his attention. And I really believe that when we come to Hosea, the 4th chapter, we are looking at a little cutout of history that can just be taken like a pattern, a dress pattern, and cut out of prophecy and laid out on a sheet of the 20th century, and we will find that it fits us perfectly. And I think that when it comes right down to it, that God could say to the United States of America today that the Lord has a controversy with the inhabitants of the land because there is no truth. There is no mercy. There is no knowledge of God in the land. I suspect, I may be wrong, but I suspect that Israel at the time Hosea did this prophecy had gone further along the road of moral depravity than we have. It's a sobering thought. Because we look at our nation today, and any serious student of what's happening in this country has to be profoundly disturbed at the increasing violence of crime, of drug addiction, and so forth, the things that are really dragging our nation down. We have to be concerned about it. And yet, when I read prophecy, I am left again and again with the conclusion that Israel, at the time these prophets spoke, was at a later stage of decay than we are at this particular moment in time. He says there is no truth, there is no mercy, there is no knowledge of God in the land. By swearing and lying and stealing and committing adultery, they break out and blood touches blood. Now you remember when you're reading prophecy, you will read the prophets use figures of speech. They use imagery to kind of draw your attention to things, and they will oftentimes use graphic images that have a certain power to them. And the image that is drawn here is that crime is so rampant that the blood from this crime runs down the street and mingles with the blood of the next crime. That from crime to crime, the blood can touch blood from place to place in the land. Israel, at the time Hosea wrote, was a very violent community. Not entirely unlike the communities that many of you live in right now. I can't help when I read this to read this by swearing and lying. Do you know what he means by that? He means you go into court, you hold up your right hand and say, I swear, to tell the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth, so help me God. And then you proceed to lie. What do we call it? We call it perjury. Well, in the last few weeks, I have sat and watched my television set with absolute disbelief and hear people saying, well, people lie all the time in civil cases, and nobody ever gets prosecuted for lying in civil cases, and lying in a matter that's not a material matter in a civil case is not really perjury. I mean, have you heard, I don't, maybe you watch it, maybe you don't, but I have watched it and I just, in stunned disbelief, that we have lawyers on television telling us it really isn't a very big deal if you hold up your right hand, swear to tell the truth, and then lie. What are we supposed to make of this? Well, what was going on then? They were swearing and lying. Swearing and lying. Swearing and lying. Now, I don't want to prejudge the President of the United States. It's entirely possible that he's telling the truth. But if it turns out he's not, are we going to conclude that the man held up his hand, swore to tell the truth, lied, and it's no big deal? And then think that mindset is not going to matter in our community? I don't know if any of you were watching also the trial of the Sergeant Major of the Army, who was on trial because of sexual assault of, 6 women and obstruction of justice and so forth, and he was acquitted on the assault of the 6 women and held to his feet to the fire only on the charge of obstruction of justice, which is a really peculiar legal argument that gets us to that place. Did it occur to you to wonder at all if the enlisted personnel, who were enlisted people, I noticed, on the jury, who actually heard the case and made the decision, were in any way influenced by the question of whether or not we shall send this man to prison for what we believe the President of the United States has done? That the jury didn't know what was going on, the jury had not read that, and that whether he has done it or not, that they might very well have believed that we have got a situation here where there's no way in the world that I'm going to send this man to prison based upon what I've actually seen take place in Washington, D.C., in the Senate, in the House, in the White House, in a government that doesn't seem to think that much of lying and killing and stealing and committing adultery. What can I tell you? When I look at what I see in politics today at the very highest level, I see a level of moral corruption that is astonishing to me. And then I look at the country in a whole, and I look at the polls. And the moral corruption is troubling, but not nearly as troubling as the polls. Over half the people in this country believe that the President of the United States lied under oath in a court of law. Over half of them believe that. And of that group of people, a sizable number of them do not believe that anything should be done about it. Now, I would love to talk to some of those. If any of you people who answered that poll are here that way, I'd love to chat with you afterward, because I'd really like to know what in the world you were thinking. That I don't think you believe that it was perfectly all right for the President to lie under oath, but when you take the polls, you can't get away from the fact that there's somebody out there who believes precisely that. It is very, very troubling. Then he makes a statement as a result of what is happening. And what you see happening in Washington, folks, is really nothing more than a mirror of what's happening in your community, next door, down the block, across the street. It's happening. And people say everybody does it. I'm sorry. They're right. Well, I know not everyone doesn't. You don't. And I don't. And there are still enough people in this country. I made a statement on a radio program one day. I said, I think we all ought to get up every morning, get on our knees, and thank God for the 10 righteous people that are keeping the rest of us alive. And I was hearkening back to Sodom and Gomorrah. Because there are still enough people in this country who are righteous that the rest of us are still being spared by God. But the situation was not a happy one for us. He then says, therefore shall the land mourn, and every one that dwells therein shall just waste away. With the beasts of the field, with the fowls of heaven, the fishes of the sea shall be taken away. Now, I want you to break your mind loose for a moment from a literal point of view and realize that what we are getting here is a kind of poetic imagery. And if you will visualize a field, as he says here, that is mourning, that the land itself, the dirt, is mourning, and the plants are wilting away. The beasts of the field have their heads down and are becoming emaciated and starved in their appearance. The fishes of the sea are not even there. You go fishing, there's nothing there to take the bait. it's really a terrible situation, but it's not the land and the beast and the fish he's talking about. That's a poetic imagery. He's talking about us. He's talking about our hearts. He's talking about the way that we ourselves are becoming discouraged and depressed and trodden down in a realization that it's every man for himself, it seems like, in society anymore. He says, let no man strive nor reprove another, for your people are like they that would argue with or strive with the priests. Now let me tell you something first of all about prophets as well. When you see them talking about priests and princes in the Old Testament and prophets, they are really talking about, in modern day, the equivalent of the Senate and the House and the President. Because in those times, that was the civil government. The priests were involved heavily in civil government. You have a dispute with your neighbor over land, you take it to court. The man sitting in court listening to your case will probably be a priest. So we're not talking so much religiously, although the religious overtones are there when he speaks of the priest and prophet. He is also speaking of the civil government of the people at that time. You people are like people that will just argue with your own government, argue with your senator, strive with your congressman. Therefore you shall fall in the day when the prophet shall fall with you in the night, and I will destroy your mother. My people are destroyed for a lack of knowledge. Well, why would that happen? I mean, how could we be destroyed for a lack of knowledge, we who live ourselves in a time of increased knowledge and great knowledge? And why would Israel of old have been lacking in knowledge? Because you have rejected knowledge. I will reject you. It's not that the knowledge isn't there. It's not that you can't have it. I mean, look at the knowledge that's available to us today. Look at all of you here with your Bibles open in front of you. You've got Bibles. You have the knowledge. It's available to you all the time. He says, but be rejected knowledge, I will reject you. That you shall be no priest to me, no leader, no governor. Seeing you have forgotten the law of your God, I will also forget your children. That passage of Scripture makes my blood run cold. Because you have forgotten the law of your God, I will forget your children. And when I look at what happened in Jonesboro and what's happening all over this country every day in the gang wars and the inner cities and what have you, I see a country in which God seems to have, in general, abandoned our children. That is a frightening concept. But here it is. It stares at it. You have forgotten the law of your God? I'll forget your children. Now, why would that work that way? Why would that be? Why the law of your God? Why wouldn't he say, because you have forgotten your God? Why did he say, because you have forgotten the law of your God? Well, a lot of people, I think, do not understand that the law of God came into existence with the creation of man, the laws that have to do with man. They are laws that have to do with the way things work. They do not require God to intervene to beat you about the head and shoulders if you break them. You break the law breaks you. The law has its own penalty. The law has its own impact. And when you begin to forsake the law of God, you are steadily moving away from a knowledge or any foundation for a difference between right and wrong. If you do not accept the law of God, where do you go for a distinction, a description of right and wrong? How can I know? Well, I can talk about what works. I can say, well, society has found over generations that it works better for a man to have one wife at a time and so forth and so on. I can argue that. But on the other hand, I could argue that to a kid I'm trying to teach, and he could then think, though, but he knows all kinds of people who have not gotten married at all and lived with women and lived with multiple women and lived with women after women, and their lives seem to be okay. You know, as far as anything I can tell right now, they're all right. And I can argue with him that, well, society has proven over the years it's better to respect personal property and we shouldn't steal from one another. And yet people steal all the time and get rich. Some of the wealthiest people around are people who are thieves and have taken advantage of other people and walked over other people. If you just look at what works in society at large and you look at what we can know about what works, are you sure we're going to see it? And by what authority are you going to teach it to your children? When you abandon the authority of God that comes along with His law and the knowledge of right and wrong and the awareness that God Almighty says this is right and this is wrong, you leave your children without any kind of moral anchor. And the reason why children are responding differently in this world today to what is going on is because some children still have a semblance of an anchor, and most do not. Even among those who do not, there are influences that keep them from doing certain kinds of things, and so they don't do them. All children don't kill. All children don't steal. All children, well, I won't say all children don't lie, because I think it's pretty hard for them to get to adulthood without telling a lie somewhere along the line. But there are children who lie, and then there are children who really lie. And we all know the difference between them. We also know that children are born into this world with different personalities and different predilections, and we know they make their own choices as they go along. And we do our best to influence those choices. And all of the forces that are at work on a child to lead and pull and tug in one way or another are, well, it's very hard to put together any kind of an idea of what's the dominant influence, what produced this result, what produced that result, why did this child kill somebody, why did the other child not. It's really hard to sit down and work your way through all of those things. Recently, in the radio program, I've been going through the Sermon on the Mount. You won't hear it for a while yet because we're taping in advance on them. I was really struck as I read through Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount and realized what he was doing there. I think it's probably more sermons have been delivered on the Sermon on the Mount than about anything else that Jesus ever said. And yet, I really wonder somehow how many people who speak on that really understand what was going on. When Jesus said, "Don't think I've come to destroy the law or the prophets. I've not come to destroy them. Till heaven and earth pass, not one jot nor one tittle shall pass from the law, till everything has come to pass and been so forth." He did not come to do away with the law. And then he proceeds in the Sermon on the Mount to begin to teach the law. I have heard people say that Jesus did not come to let down the barrier of the law. He came to raise the barrier higher. He came to make the law more strict than it might have otherwise been. No, that's not really quite what he was doing. The thing that Jesus does in the Sermon on the Mount, and you really need to go back and read it very carefully, if you understand that the violation of the law of God is something that hurts you, and the reason why God said it is wrong is because it hurts you. Let me back up a moment. I had a friend once, a guy on the internet the other day said this. He said, "The way I look at it, sin is vanilla, and God hates vanilla." Think about it. The only reason why I wouldn't have vanilla ice cream then is not because it's going to hurt me, not because it's intrinsically bad, because actually it tastes very good. It's only because God doesn't like for me to have that particular thing. And you'd be surprised how many people think of God's law in those terms. But if you're going to draw that analogy, what you're going to have to conclude is sin is a slow killer that tastes like vanilla. And God tells us that sin is a slow killer and tells us to stay away from it, even though we can't see it. It's a very different thing. But back to the Sermon on the Mount and what it is that Jesus is doing there. You will find that Jesus is not trying to set the bar higher. He is trying to set the bar closer. What he is doing is telling you that the harm that you do to yourself by committing sin begins when you contemplate and deal with and begin to participate with the sin in your heart. You have heard it said by them of old time, "You shall not commit adultery." And there is a presumption on many people's part that if I just don't commit adultery, the act, it doesn't matter what else I might do. Think about it. The letter of the law says, "You shall not commit adultery." Well, I haven't broken the letter of the law, therefore I have not sinned. This is one view of the law. But why is adultery a sin? Well, adultery is a sin because it changes you. It changes the person you commit adultery with. It is destructive to society. It's destructive to children. It ruins homes. It is terribly destructive force. Jesus says, "But I say unto you, he that looks upon a woman to lust after her in his heart has committed adultery with her already in his heart." The harm to him has already been done. That's not to say that it doesn't make any difference if he goes on, because there is more harm to be done. But what Jesus is saying is, you start tearing yourself down long before you break the letter of the law. Set the bar higher. He set it closer. You can't just go running right up to that and expect not to get into trouble. Can a man take fire into his bosom and not be burned, as the Scripture says? You're going to play around with this, and sooner or later, it's going to destroy you. The Pharisees of Jesus' day believed that they could do almost anything as long as they came up short of the actual, literal violation of the law. And in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus teaches the law. He is a teacher of the law. And he teaches the law from a different perspective. He says the law hasn't been abolished. What I am telling you is you're going to begin your destructive behavior when you entertain the sin in your heart, long before you ever do the act. And it's not enough to not do the act. So, when we look at this question that he raises in Hosea, because you have forgotten the law of your God, I will forget your children. He is really talking about what's going to happen to our children when we neglect to instill in them from the beginning an awareness of the law of God, and for those of us living in our generation, an awareness of the law of God as taught by Jesus Christ. For there are many teachers of the law that have come and gone down through history, and many of them have their interpretations and their ideas of the way the law should be kept. Those rabbis are not our rabbi. Jesus is our master. And it is his interpretation of the law that is important to us. But if we don't teach our children, if we don't instill in them the awareness that there is such a thing as right and wrong, that God does exist, that he does care, that the Bible is a revelation of what's good and bad for man, and to show them the way in which they can live, then in the process of time, the world will wear them down. The world is like a great weight. It's like a ball and chain. It's like a mill that you throw your kids into that grinds away. And unless we do our job with our children, the world will grind them down. What part of the world? Is it the movies? Is it violence? Is it cartoons? Is it guns? Is it the schools? Is it drugs? Is it all of the above? Is it a combination? Is it your own child's particular trials that he has to face in school or wherever he goes? The truth is that the forces and the influences of evil in this world are so many and so varied that trying to tackle the forces of evil will lead you chasing your tail like a poor, deranged dog. Then what do? You pursue good. Chasing evil and trying to defeat evil is an exercise in futility because there is too much of it. And frankly, there is an ebb and flow of evil in and out of our world. I'm convinced of it. As I watch the tracks of the devil, as he marches through society, that we have got to keep defenses up. And the world will be pulling and tugging and wearing and beating and pounding on our defenses all the time because the forces of evil are here. And unless the defenses are there, the wall will come down. Jonesboro last week. And the evil, as it struck out at other people who were innocent of whatever particular demons, I don't mean that literally, I'm speaking in a figurative sense, may have been pursuing these two boys. Because we don't need demons to commit evil. There is in this world an enormous amount of just plain, good old-fashioned human evil. There's enough of that to go around. But the world keeps on dragging. Because you have forgotten the law of God, I will also forget your children. As they were increased, so they sinned against me. That right there is one of the most damning sentences I've ever read. As they were increased, so they sinned against me. And if you've watched very much television again recently, and listen to the reporters and the analysts as they talk about what's going on in the country today, and they'll say to themselves, well, why is it that when over half of the people believe the president has lied under oath, held up his hand, sworn to tell the truth, and then lied, how is it that some 65, 70% of them give him a job approval and everything? Why is it so many of them don't want him impeached? Why is all this true? And the reporters will come back and they'll say, it's because we have 4-point-something unemployment. It's because the Dow Jones average is flirting with 9,000. We have never had better economic times in our history. And we are willing to put up with nearly anything rather than rock the boat. It is an indictment that leaves me nearly speechless. I can't afford to be speechless because I'm standing up here. Or I might well be. As they were increased, so they sinned against me. Therefore I will change their glory into shame. I will tell you this, looking at the combination that I see today, I am probably the world's worst stock market prognosticator, so pay no attention to me on that regard. Don't even pay attention to what I'm about to tell you. But just reading the Scripture, and then hearing what people are saying about why it is that we are willing to tolerate evil in this country is because we are so prosperous. To me, that is on the verge of tempting God. And if I were God, I would only conclude one thing. Well, if they can't stand prosperity, let's see how they handle poverty. Well, that's what happened to Israel, as a matter of fact. They went into captivity, became slaves. And they wondered where their next meal was coming from. And when they went to bed at night, they'd say, "Oh, would God it was morning." And they get up in the morning and say, "Oh, would God it was night." And the bed was too short to get comfortable in, and it was too narrow for them to be able to sleep, and they were miserable and poor, wretched people because they did not serve God with joy of heart for the abundance of all things. But, I don't think it takes a prophet to figure out that prosperity is dangerous. That whenever things are going too well for us, we tend to assume it's because we're getting everything right, never realize that maybe we've just been lucky. They eat up the sin of my people. They set their heart on their iniquity, and there shall be like people like priests. And I will punish them for their ways and reward them for their doings, for they shall eat and not have enough. They'll commit whoredom and not increase, because they have left off to take heed to the Lord. They just quit listening to me. And as a people, we have quit listening to God. The schools, from all I can tell, are basically prohibited from talking about God. You can't pray. Almost as though you can't even pretend to pray. You can't have a moment of silence in which people might pray, not officially. I gather the children now are the ones that are bringing prayer into schools. And some of those who brought it into school in Kentucky got themselves shot to doll rags because they did bring it in. Whoredom and wine and new wine take away the heart. Whoredom and wine and new wine. And when you consider the incredible whoredom that exists, and you think in terms of, has that whoredom touched the highest leadership in the land? Then you couple this with a statement, whoredom and wine and new wine take away the heart. What does that mean? It means it takes away their understanding. It takes away their judgment. It takes a sharp knife and just cuts the core right out of their value system. When the value system is gone, you don't have a basis for making sensible, sound, intelligent judgments. I won't go to Isaiah today, but one of the things in the early chapters of Isaiah that's so striking to me is the fact that it makes that sharp connection between adultery, sin, and particularly lying, and a loss of judgment. You just keep on lying, and pretty soon you don't know what the truth is. And when you don't know what the truth is, your judgment isn't worth a pile of dung. That's why it scares me to death to see lying at the highest levels of government in our country. Now, I'm not talking right this minute about things we don't know. I'm talking about things we know. Now, I make it a habit every Sunday morning of watching Meet the Press, this week with David Brinkley, and any of the other programs that I can catch where they actually bring members of the government on camera, put the camera on their face where you can see their eyes, and they try to ask them the hard questions that we the people would like to have answers to. And it really disturbs me. Something about this disturbs me terribly. That of all the elected officials and the higher the elected official, the more this is true, the less likely you are to get a straight answer out of any of them. If the person comes from the White House, you ask him the hard question, he will give you the canned answer. The word is spin. You ask him another hard question. Ask the same question from a different angle. He will give you another canned answer. There are one or two politicians up there who will go on those weekend shows and will give you a yes or a no when you ask them a question. Right now, the only one that comes to mind that you can ask him one of those hard questions and he will say, yes, is Daniel Patrick Moynihan, Democratic senator from New York. I've heard him do it on, he'll say yes, or he'll say no. And he seems to be a fairly truthful man. One of the things that nearly got Ross Perot elected when he ran for president, that really got him some support from a lot of people, is that they thought he was telling the truth. They thought he was being level. He thought he was leveling. There's no spin here. Yes, no. None of this maybe, not fooling around. This is what we're going to do. But in the end, we lost confidence even in Ross Perot because he began to squirm on us a little bit. He began to twist. And when I see that again and again from leaders of the Senate, all the way from Trent Lott, the leader in the Senate this last weekend, over a relatively minor issue of whether you're going to call something a tax or an income stream, and he just squirms around that question instead of just saying, oh, sure, it's a tax, but we got to have some taxes, folks. Instead of just leveling with us, he's so afraid of the headlines on Monday morning that'll show up in the paper, Trent Lott says we'll have a tax increase. He is so afraid of that he will spin the thing around to where you have really not entirely sure what he's saying or what he believes. Democrats, Republicans, the President, the Congress. You know, I don't know about you folks, but I am so thirsty for a politician that will just tell me the truth. I would vote for him if I didn't agree with his policies. Because if I didn't agree with his policies, I would know the man is at least honest enough that if I ask him a question, I can get a straight answer out of it. I know he's at least honest enough that if he sees his policy is bad, he'll change it. But to vote for a man who will tell me what I want to hear in order to get elected, forget it. You know, you might as well, when you go out to build a brand new house, and you get these people who are going to give you a cost-plus contract, and you ask them, what's the house going to cost to build? And they come back and this guy says, well, it's going to cost you $75,000. Another builder comes back and says it's going to cost you $85,000. Another one comes back and says it's going to cost $75,000. Now, which of you people on a cost plus, he's going to actually build, this is not what he's going to build, this is not a turnkey job. He's actually going to charge you what the house costs plus his percentage. All three of them. Right? I wonder how many of you, don't put your hands up because I'm going to tell you something about yourself. If you're the kind of person who will go with the cheapest of those builders on that, you are a fool. Because all he's doing is telling you what you want to hear. The chances are it will cost more than the most expensive of the three that you hear. They lie to you to get your business. You're going to build a house. Don't you want a builder that'll tell you the truth? That may be an oxymoron, I don't know. But nevertheless, that's what you would like to have happen. No, I honestly believe there are builders out there like that. I believe there are builders who will tell you the truth. But it's really kind of thing going on at the highest level of the government, where they will tell you that they believe in this policy when they don't, and they get elected, and then they go back to what they really believe. Well, you'd been better off voting for some guy who told you up front what he really believed, even though you didn't agree with it. The lying, and not to mention the adultery, because the stuff is all of a piece that exists at the highest levels in our country now, is becoming very disturbing. It is becoming disturbing for a couple of reasons. One is, of course, that we understand that the men who are doing this are wrong and they're sinning and there's mistakes that they're making. But there's a heavier reason. Personal sin that you or I commit, that's between us and God. That's what we got to live with that. But when we're talking people at the highest levels of government who are lying and cheating and cutting corners and who knows what else they're doing, this is bad. Because they can get people killed very easily. And a man who you have to depend on these people. When they tell you the reason why they are sending your sons and your daughters to the Middle East to bomb Saddam Hussein and try to blow up, you got to depend on the person that's doing that to tell you the truth, don't you? If he'll lie to you about one thing, what makes you think he wouldn't lie to you about another? You see, the culture of our country has become a culture of lies. To the extent that people, you can tell what they think because of what they put in these opinion polls. I know you don't believe that. I know you don't feel that way. What I'm telling you, though, is that you are living in a culture of lies. And in a culture of lies, to go looking for answers to single-shot problems of killers of teenage kids is a dead-end street. You can't depend on who tells you anything anyway in a culture of lies. No, I'm afraid the solution to the problem in this country goes a lot deeper than that. He said, my people ask counsel of their stocks, and their staff declares unto them, for the spirit of whoredoms causes them to err, and they have gone a-whoring from under their God. They sacrifice on the tops of mountains. They burn incense on the hills, under oaks and poplars, and because the shadow thereof is good. Therefore, now this is interesting, because they have gone to the other religions of that time, and the other religions of that time, folks, were rather different from the Baptists, Methodists, Presbyterians, and so forth of our day. They're rather different from that. These were people who would burn their own children alive in a fire to their God. These were people who had temple prostitutes, where as a part of the religious act, you went in there, paid your money, and had sex with a temple prostitute. These were rather different religions that he's talking about here at this time. He says, because you have gone to these, your daughters shall commit whoredom, your spouses will commit adultery. And then he says something that is really astonishing. I want you to think about this. I will not punish your daughters when they commit whoredom, nor your spouses when they commit adultery. Why would he say that? I won't punish them. Well, there's something you need to know. That what happens when you sin, there are three really serious things that can happen. One is consequences, and the other is punishment, and the other is destruction. Punishment, by and large, when God actually takes in hand a rod to punish, this is chastisement. And the object of chastisement is what? Modified behavior, right? When you punish, you're wanting to chastise somebody to turn them around. What God has said, I'm not going to chastise your daughters when they commit whoredom. I'm going to let them go. Because you people don't pay any attention to me anymore. You don't want to know what I've got to say anymore. You won't listen. But this is what's going to happen. Because of the fact that you have forgotten the law of your God, I'll forget your children. And I'm not going to come down here and chastise them. I'm not going to reach down into the corruption and try to pull them out. I'm not going to make them turn their life around. I'm not going to rescue them for you. Why is he not going to do that? Well, because you yourselves are separated with whores. And you sacrifice with harlots. Therefore, the people that do not understand shall fall. It's serious business. You know, when you look back on Israel in this century, you realize that they were a people who had really turned away from God, and the whole society had become rotten. You know, it was something that if you just grab hold of it real tight, it starts collapsing in among your fingers, and dust starts flowing up because there is no real heart in it anymore. And we are headed in precisely the same direction. And God says it can come to the place where I'm going to forget your children, when your daughters will commit whoredom, and I'm not going to go try to get them and bring them back. Why should I do that? Because you're committing whoredom yourself. You see, you've got to have some examples somewhere. Somebody's got to stand up. Somebody's got to do what's right. Somewhere in the leadership, you've got to have some role models. He then says, though you, Israel, play the harlot, let not Judah offend. Don't come you to Gilgal. Don't go up to Beth-aven and swear the Lord lives. Don't go to these houses you built up, these churches, and swear, oh, yes, the Lord lives, while you're lying, while you're swearing. Their drink is sour. They have committed whoredom continually. The rulers with shame do love the bribe. The wind has bound her up in her wings, and they shall be ashamed because of their sacrifices. There's a lot more. But suffice it to say this, that when you look at these poor children who are now locked in jail cells, one of them crying for his mother, and you look at the families who are crying for their children, and the children who are crying for their mother, who was shot by these boys, you start looking around trying to find some place to blame, place to blame. You have to go back to the old saying again, we have met the enemy, and he is us. But the problem is not the kids, or their parents, or their grandparents. The problem is not this thing or that thing. The problem is that as a people, we have long since begun to forget our God and to turn away from our God. Now, I believe something about prophecy that I really didn't understand. I put it this way, several years ago. I believe that prophecies like this are given to us for us to look and to fear and to change. I believe that most of the prophecies you read in the Bible and most of the admonitions that come upon us even to this day are given to us. God tells us the future so that we can change the future, so that we can repent, so that we can save ourselves, or perhaps so that we can save our children. Because one of the things that we may not be able, I know we may not be able to save our society. I know we may not be able to head off the impending destruction that's coming our way. But I honestly do believe there's a great deal that we can do to save our children, our families, and ourselves. And I believe that we will be viewed as colossal failures in God's eyes if we don't do what we can. The message of the prophet is I look at what's happened. There has been a complete loss, I think, in our society of the basis for right and wrong. And this is not lost on our children. I think they understand it as well. And I ask, where are they to go for an authoritative revelation of what is right and what is wrong? To the government? To the schools? As for as far as the schools are concerned, well, there is no God. And it basically leaves home and church as the only places where these kids are going to be able to be told the things they need. And you know, I honestly think that one of the primary missions of a church, if you as a local church are having trouble figuring out what you are all about, I really feel that one of the primary missions of a church is children. And what we can do to save children, what we can do to nurture them, to bring them up in the admonition of God and of the Lord, I think that this is a very important part of what we are supposed to do. The job nowadays is so tough that a lot of parents cannot handle it by themselves. They need help. And there are a lot of women in this church who have children and no man in that child's life. That's where the church comes in. That's where brothers in the faith come in. That's where fathers of other children come in. Because there is a lot that we can do about our children, about the children of our neighbors. But before we can do it, we have to care. And we have to also believe that what we do makes a difference.